If you've ever looked at modern wedding prices and felt your stomach drop, you're not alone. Because the truth is, weddings today cost so much that a lot of people are skipping the aisle altogether. But before you judge them, you need to hear what a wedding actually cost in 1980. Because once you hear these numbers, you might wonder why anyone even bothers planning a big ceremony anymore. Let me ask you something right at the start. Do you remember your wedding day or your parents' wedding day? Because depending on when it happened, the cost might have been so different that it feels like another universe. If you lived through the late 70s or early 80s, you know exactly what I mean. What you're about to hear isn't just a comparison, it's a reality check about how far the wedding industry has drifted from the lives of regular people. And here's the part nobody expects. Weddings used to be expensive in their own way, sure, but they didn't financially crush you the way they do now. Let that sit with you for a second, because before we start rattling off numbers, I want you to think of a modern wedding you've been to. Maybe a friend's, maybe your own kids', and ask yourself, how does anyone afford this? Keep that question in the back of your mind, because the answer becomes clearer the deeper we go. Now imagine it's the year 1980. Gas is around $1.19 a gallon. The average income is roughly $12,500 a year. Houses cost about $47,000, and people are still writing checks at the grocery store. Life isn't cheap, but it's not strangling you either. Now think of the phrase wedding budget. It meant something totally different back then. Before I tell you the total cost, I want you to guess a number. Because I guarantee whatever you're thinking, the real answer still feels unbelievable today. Got that number? Good, because the average 1980 wedding cost around $3,500, not $35,000, even $10,000. It's just $3,500. And that covered the venue, dress, catering, flowers, invitations, music, the photographer, the whole thing. Let that sink in for a moment. In today's world, $3,500 barely covers the suit rentals and the cake. And here's where it gets even crazier. Even high-end weddings in 1980 rarely crossed $10,000 unless you were seriously trying to show off. A lot of people planned ceremonies in church halls, backyard gardens, community centers, or simple banquet rooms that didn't require you to sell a kidney to book. And if you're someone who remembers those days, tell me, does this sound familiar? But this is where the story takes a turn. Because just like today, the dress was one of the biggest emotional purchases. The average wedding dress in 1980 cost about $400. And before you say, that sounds kinda high, remember, these were handmade styles with real lace, real stitching, and real fabrics. Today's average dress? Howin', $1,900, 5 times more, even after adjusting for inflation. And therefore, the modern wedding dress industry doesn't just cost more rent, expects more glamour, more add-ons, more profit. Now let me take you to the photographer. In 1980, photography packages averaged about $400 to $600. And you'd get a full album, the negatives, and sometimes even a small video reel if you were lucky today. Most photographers charge $2,500 to $4,000 in. That's a starting price. And this next part might hit home. Back then, you didn't have 10 edited highlight videos, drone shots, or 400 retouched images. You had 20 or 30 great shots. Maybe 50 if your photographer was enthusiastic. But those pictures lasted. They had soul. They weren't overpolished or filtered. They were real. Now here's where things get interesting again. Food, one of the biggest budget killers today, was nothing like it is now in 1980. You could cater a 100-person wedding for about $800 to $1,200. Think about that for a second. Today, catering alone is often $8,000 to $15,000, depending on location, and that's before you add appetizers, late-night snacks, custom cakes, and open bars. But in 1980, a lot of weddings used family recipes, potluck sides, or simple buffet lines. Nobody cared if the dessert table matched the color theme. People showed up to celebrate, not to critique the plating. Do you remember simpler receptions? Folding chairs? Handwritten name cards? Sheet cakes from the local bakery? Because here's the honest truth. People weren't trying to go viral with their wedding photos. There was no Pinterest board, no Instagram, no pressure to perform. The only people who saw your wedding were the ones who were actually there. But here comes the part nobody expects. Venues, which today can easily run between $8,000 and $15,000, used to cost around $500 to $800. And churches often charged nothing or just a small donation. Today, you're charged for everything: the chairs, the tables, the sound system, the lighting, the cleanup, the setup, the mandatory coordinator, the service fee, the insurance fee, the tax on the service fee, and the tax on the tax. You blink, and your quote jumps another $1,200. Let me ask you again, how does anyone afford this? Flowers, around $150 to $250 for the entire wedding in 1980. Today, florals alone can hit $3,000, especially if you want one of those trendy statement arches. Music, a DJ cost around $200. A band, maybe $400 to $600. Today, DJs start at $1,500, and bands often cross $5,000 before you even pick the playlist. And here's a memory trigger for anyone who lived through those years. Do you remember how receptions actually felt? A little messy, a little warm, a little unpolished, but full of heart. People danced without worrying about photographers catching the perfect moment. Kids fell asleep under tables. Someone's uncle always brought a disposable camera and captured blurry shots that still live in family albums. Let that picture sit with you for a second. Now think about what happens today. Everything is curated. Everything is content. Weddings have turned into full-blown productions with lighting cues, choreographed entrances, rented decorations, and 6-hour editing sessions just for the teaser video. And therefore, the cost isn't just higher, it's part of a system that pushes you to upgrade, upgrade, upgrade until you're drowning in bills. But there's one more reason weddings were cheaper in 1980. Expectations were lower. People didn't demand perfection. They didn't compare their ceremony to strangers online. They didn't need custom signage, personalized cocktails, or a photo booth with props. They just needed a room full of people they loved. And that's why couples today, when faced with $30,000 to $40,000 average wedding bills, are choosing to elope. But stick with me here, because the real twist comes when you see how much these prices have outpaced inflation. When you take the average 1980 wedding cost of about $3,500 and run it through inflation, you end up with a modern equivalent of roughly $13,000. And if weddings today actually cost $13,000, nobody would be eloping. People would complain a little, sure, but they'd still do it. The real issue is that the average modern American wedding doesn't cost $13,000. It costs over $30,000. That means the real price has doubled inflation, and that gap is exactly why couples today feel like they're drowning before they even get started. You feel the difference in your gut. You feel it the moment you look at a wedding budget spreadsheet and think, how is this supposed to be normal? And here's the part nobody really says out loud. Weddings today have become a luxury item disguised as a tradition. But if you lived through the 80s, you know weddings weren't supposed to be financial death sentences. They were just family gatherings with a dress, a cake, some flowers, and a dance floor that always smelled faintly like punch. Do you remember that? Do you remember the feeling of walking into a wedding and realizing nothing about it was trying to impress you? It was just simple and real. And somehow that made it feel even more special. And this is where the story starts to feel uncomfortable, because it forces you to think about how much the industry has changed you without you noticing. Let's go deeper into those changes. In 1980, invitations cost maybe $50 to $75 for a whole stack. Today, couples spend $500 to $1,000 just to send out pieces of paper that most guests eventually toss in the trash. The industry justifies it with words like premium cardstock and elevated design. But at the end of the day, it's ink on paper, and therefore, you're not just paying for the product, you're paying for the pressure to match a standard that didn't even exist 40 years ago. And cakes. Cakes are a whole saga themselves. A typical 1980 wedding cake cost around $100, maybe $150 if you wanted something fancy. Today, a wedding cake can hit $600 to $900 easily. And if you add custom designs or specialty flavors, you're suddenly looking at prices over $1,000. That's before the cake cutting fee. Yes, some venues charge you to slice the cake you already paid for. Let that sit with you. Your grandparents would have laughed out loud at that idea. Now think about honeymoon costs. In 1980, a week-long honeymoon usually ran about $600 to $1,000, depending on the destination. Today, honeymoons often climb past $4,000 before you even start adding excursions or resort upgrades. And here's the part that really shifts the conversation. In 1980, a honeymoon felt like a treat. Today, it feels like an obligation. People feel guilty if they don't book something Instagram-worthy, which again shows you how expectations have been rewired. But let's bring it back to the heart of this. Do you know the biggest difference between 1980 and 2025 weddings? It wasn't the price, it wasn't the dresses or the venues, it was the mindset. Back then, couples weren't afraid to start small. They weren't pressured to create a perfect day. They were allowed to be normal people having a normal wedding in a normal venue. And when you remove that pressure, everything else becomes lighter, cheaper, and easier to breathe through. And therefore, when you look at the modern trend of eloping, it suddenly makes sense. Couples are choosing small mountaintop ceremonies, courthouse vows, backyard gatherings, or simple dinners with close family, not because they hate tradition, but because they hate debt. They're not running away from marriage, they're running away from invoices. Now let me give you a memory trigger that might hit deep. Think of the last old wedding photo you've seen from your parents or grandparents. Notice how they're smiling, not posing. Notice how nothing in the background looks curated. Notice how the dress wasn't covered in crystals and beads. It was simple, elegant, and real. Notice how the venue wasn't decorated with thousands of dollars of rented furniture. It was just a room. But look at the joy in those pictures. Look at the way the couple held each other. Look at how people danced without worrying what they looked like. That's the part of weddings money can't buy, no matter the year. Here's another curveball. In 1980, couples didn't have to take out personal loans to get married. Today, an estimated 1/3 of couples go into debt for their wedding. And that's the part you feel in your chest. Because when starting your life together begins with monthly payments, it doesn't take long for the stress to creep in. In fact, financial strain from weddings has become one of the quiet reasons some marriages crack early. Nobody likes talking about that, but it's real. Let me ask you directly, if you were getting married today, would you pay $30,000 for one day? Or would you take that same money and put it toward a home, a car, a honeymoon, or paying down debt? Most people today don't even have to think about it. But this story isn't just about the numbers. It's about what those numbers reveal. Weddings used to be emotional gatherings. Now, they've become commercial projects. And therefore, it's no surprise younger generations are rewriting the script entirely. Backyard weddings are trending again. Tiny ceremonies are trending again. Elopements are breaking records because couples would rather invest in their future than impress strangers for 4 hours. So why does this matter? Because when you strip away all the noise, weddings were never supposed to be about budgets, decor, or curated perfection. They were about two people choosing each other. Everything else was optional. Let me give you one last nostalgia hit. Picture a 1980 reception with plastic cups, paper plates, folding tables, and a DJ playing cassettes. Picture your relatives laughing, kids weaving between chairs, and people dancing with no phones in sight. Picture the bride's dress catching the light, not because it was covered in sequins, but because she was genuinely happy. That's what weddings were. That's what weddings should feel like. And if any of this brought back a memory, your wedding, your parents' wedding, or one you once attended, hold on to that feeling for a second. You felt it because it was real, not because it was expensive. If something in this story took you back, you'll feel right at home with the next one.